Headphones versus IEMs. Which one's better when it comes to comfort, sound quality, and value for money? Well, hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and I've reviewed literally hundreds of IEMs and headphones over the year. And the truth is that, well, they both have advantages depending on your use case and what you value. But these are things that might not be obvious if you're just getting into the hobby. So whether you're getting into audio because you want something for at-home music listening or for gaming or for something on the go, I really do think it's worth considering both of them. And in this episode of Waveguide, I'm going to talk about how headphones and IEMs are different along a couple of categories, including comfort, some practical reasons you might not be thinking about, and of course, sound quality. And if you like the idea of helpful content like this, well, you're also going to like our sponsor, HiFiGo. HiFiGo is an online retailer. They sell headphones and IEMs, all the latest stuff. So if you already know what you want, I would check them out. I've got them linked in the description down below, free shipping worldwide. But if you're still trying to figure out between IEMs and headphones, we'll stick around and we'll talk about that. So comfort is going to be the first factor you encounter when you're comparing headphones and IEMs. And frankly, I think it's a big reason a lot of people don't get into IEMs. It's just that headphones are a lot more familiar of a form factor for a lot of people, whereas IEMs, I feel like they've got a bit of a learning curve to them, right? The first time you wear an IEM, you put something inside your ear, it might be initially uncomfortable. You might not have done that before. There might be a little bit of an ick factor, but what I'm going to say is that you can get used to this. And for me, an analogy is like when I grew up my beard, for example, I started feeling hair on my neck in ways that was just kind of scratchy initially. But after a couple of days, I got used to it. And I think it's probably the same thing with, people wear contact lenses instead of eyeglasses. Is you're stuffing something inside your eye that can't be comfortable, but eventually you get used to it. It just kind of falls into the background of your being. And IEMs are, at least for me, a lot like that. Now, I see a lot of people wearing TWS, true wireless IEMs lately, and I think that kind of just shows that you don't need to be an audiophile to get used to having something inside your ear, although I will comment on that typically audiophile IEMs will fit a little bit deeper in your ears than an AirPod Pro, for example. So, like, my wife hates my IEMs, but she has no problem using true wireless IEMs, so there is that. Now, I think, however, the bigger factor, apart from just the initial ickness, is the fact that IEMs are a little bit more personal than headphones, right? Headphones, they're a little bit more one size fits all, whereas IEMs, you might need to spend more time finding an IEM that fits your ear especially well. So the IEM that's comfortable for me might not be comfortable for you, and vice versa. And that's just frankly kind of back to that idea of there being a little bit of a learning curve with IEMs. For me personally, I tend to prefer an IEM that fits small, something that fits into like the folds of my ear right there so that it's stable and comfortable. I think this Sennheiser IE600 is a pretty good example of that. And I guess if we're keeping tally of things here in terms of comfort, again, first impressions, I'm gonna give that advantage over here to headphones. And for ease of use, I think frankly I'm also going to give it to headphones, but that's not to say that I don't find IEMs comfortable, because I wear them all the time. On the other hand, headphones, while they might be more comfortable out the gate, they've got some issues that might show themselves more over time. For example, clamp, right? A lot of headphones, you put them on your head, it's going to squeeze your head in order to stay in place. And that squeezing, that clamp, can become an issue for a lot of people over the longer term. Personally, I'm pretty immune to clamp pressure concerns, but I know it's a very, very common thing that people will cite when they're talking about headphone comfort long term. For me, more so, I'll have issues with pressure points along the top of my head. Within 5 to 10 minutes, I can start to feel that, and it can make a headphone, frankly, really, really uncomfortable. So clamp can be an issue, but it can also be an issue not having enough clamp, because you want enough clamp that's going to hold the headphone in place so you don't feel like you're always constantly trying to balance it on your neck. Kind of a similar related issue is just the issue of weight. Your average headphone is probably going to weigh 300, 400, maybe even 500 grams, whereas your average IEM, heck, the heaviest IEM I've ever measured is about 30 grams, so about 1/10 of the weight of even a lightweight headphone. And that is something that will show up over time. Like, the more you wear it, you will start to be more aware of that weight. Personally, I find that a headphone that's, 300 or 400 grams, I don't really have an issue with. Your mileage may vary depending on your own tolerances, but anything above 400, 500 grams, you will start to feel over the long term, and it's just something you got to be mindful of. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of sort of these long-term impacts is actually heat. And this is not something I personally deal with because I live in a pretty cool climate, but I see this reported by a lot of people who live in warmer, more humid climates that over-ear headphones can be actually kind of uncomfortable because of the heat and the humidity, right? You basically are creating a little swamp inside your ear pad where your ear is. And this is especially true of a closed back headphone, but I think can also be true of an open back headphone. So if you're in a warm, humid climate, that's definitely something that you want to consider. Of course, I mentioned that headphones are more of a one-size-fits-all thing, but you're definitely going to have to find out, for yourself what actually works well for you. What kind of weight are you tolerant to? What kind of clamp do you like? And also, what size ear pad do you like? Personally, I like kind of like a medium-sized ear pad like this, where you've got enough room for your ear, but it's not so big that it's swimming on my head. Yeah, I'd say that personally for me, this is kind of an ideal form factor for a headphone. It's around 300 grams or less, which means it's probably going to be made out of plastic, and that's fine. It's got a decent bit of clamp to it, so it's nice and stable, and so I'm aerodynamic when I fight.
It makes me aerodynamic when I fight.
Yeah, I just generally like the ear cup's not too big. This is a good mix for me. So if we go back to our scorecard, in terms of long-term comfort, this might not be intuitive for a lot of people, but I'm actually going to give this one to IEMs. Now, there are also some other practical considerations that you should keep in mind. For example, do you wear glasses? Because if you wear glasses like me, well, IEMs might have a little bit of an issue where, you put them over your ear, they basically coexist with the frame of your glasses, and you might get a little bit of tangling and just, it's a bit of a traffic jam there. You get used to it, and frankly, I think that is a pretty minor point. Maybe a bigger point, however, would be with headphones, which, unsurprisingly, they fit over the top of your glasses frames, which has kind of two potential issues. One, if you're sensitive to that clamp that I was just talking about, having your headphones clamp your glasses into the side of your head might be additionally more uncomfortable. But the other thing is that a lot of headphones they rely on a good seal with the ear pad and your head to get the bass response out of the headphone. But when you've got glasses in here, you're kind of breaking that seal and you might end up with a suboptimal bass response. So as far as the scorecard goes in terms of being glasses compatible, I'm actually going to give that win to IEMs. Another practical consideration a lot of people don't think about until it's a problem is the occlusion effect. And to know what I'm talking about, if you're not familiar with this effect, just start talking or even like humming. And while you're humming, plug your ears and you're going to notice that the sound changes quite a bit and it's probably going to sound a lot more annoying. That is the occlusion effect. And because IEMs sit inside your ear and plug your ear and create a seal, well, these things will create the occlusion effect pretty hardcore. Now, closed back headphones can also create an occlusion effect to some degree, although usually not as extreme as IEMs. But generally, open back headphones don't have this issue. Now, that effect that I was talking about, it's not just when you're humming. It affects you also while you're talking, or even if you're doing like exercise and you're running or jumping, like it can create this obnoxious sound inside your head. And for those reasons, like I don't really like using IEMs for exercise or for gaming when I have to talk with people. It's just frankly not comfortable. Now, there are some ways to mitigate the occlusion effect. For example, just like routing audio from the outside world into your ears while you've got them sealed can solve this problem, right? For example, if you've used AirPods with their transparency mode, that's what they're doing, and it avoids the occlusion effect. Or if you're recording a podcast in a studio or something like that, if you're self-monitoring your own voice, it can avoid that. However, if you're in a situation where you don't have access to those technologies, the occlusion effect here with IEMs versus headphones can be a big problem. And so if we're keeping score here, good while talking, there's very much a big advantage for open back headphones, in my opinion. Now, the occlusion effect is related to the next big practical difference between headphones and IEMs, and that is sound isolation. And what I mean is that an open back headphone like this doesn't have the occlusion effect because it doesn't isolate sound. If you're in a loud environment, like an office or public transport, all of the sound from the outside environment is going to enter the ear cup and it's going to hit your ear. You're still going to hear it just like normal. If you're trying to quiet that stuff, an open back headphone, frankly, is not going to do that. And it kind of works both ways. Like if you're in a quiet environment, like a library, and you're listening to music, especially if you're listening loud, well, all of the music you're listening to on the headphone is going to leak out the back of the speakers, and people sitting around you are going to be able to hear. Whereas with an IEM, because these things seal so well and isolate so well, you could blast your ears off, be sitting right next to somebody, and they wouldn't know. Not that I recommend you blast your ears off. In fact, one of the nice advantages of this sound isolation is that you can actually get away with listening at quieter volumes because you're not competing with sound from the outside environment. So if we're talking about purely from sound isolation, I think this is a pretty strong advantage for IEMs. Now, the next practical difference is pretty obvious, but there are some knock-on effects that are not so obvious, and that's just that IEMs are a lot smaller than headphones. For example, if I'm traveling, right, throwing a pair of IEMs in my bag basically takes up no additional room, whereas finding room for a pair of full-size headphones can be a problem. In fact, a lot of the times I'll bring a couple of pairs of IEMs with me because I can. Another advantage of them being small is that, at least for me, they just feel lighter, more free, less encumbered when I'm wearing a pair of IEMs. Now, if I'm sitting at a desk or at home, it doesn't really make a big difference with a headphone, but if I'm sitting on public transport or even sleeping, the small size of a pair of IEMs really does have a pretty strong advantage. And yes, I sleep in IEMs, and no, I haven't tried it with a pair of headphones. I don't think it would work. So if we go back to the board in terms of, I guess we'll just call this portability, I'm going to give that one also an advantage to IEMs. And the last practical consideration before we talk about sound quality is going to be efficiency. IEMs are a lot more efficient or sensitive than headphones, which is frankly neither a good thing or a bad thing. It just has some effects that you should be aware of. For example, if you plug in an inefficient headphone like this one into your average laptop or like a video game controller, you might find that it doesn't get loud enough, whereas IEMs, you're probably not going to have that problem. Headphones, a lot of the times you will need to use an external amplifier. Although I will say that to a large degree, this is kind of overstated. In fact, frankly, off of my MacBook, I will listen to pretty much every headphone. But nonetheless, if you're trying to get things loud, IEMs are going to be a lot more efficient. Now, that's the good part of efficiency, but there are some downsides to being as sensitive as IEMs can be. And it kind of comes down to two main categories. And again, this is going to apply to a lot of times just like the headphone jack on your laptop, or especially coming out of the back of a desktop computer. They often have two pretty sizable issues. One is going to be output impedance. The other one is going to be hiss. Let's talk about the first one. Output impedance is something you might not be aware of, but it is kind of an attribute of the electrical design of your headphone jack that can actually inadvertently shift the frequency response of your headphone or your IEM. What I mean is that the output impedance can just change the way something sounds in a way that might be good, but probably is just going to be weird. And that's something that you have to deal with more with IEMs because they are more sensitive to output impedance. And then similar, there is the fact that a lot of the times cheaper headphone jacks will just have hiss. They'll have a noise floor that you can hear when you're using a sensitive IEM. If you're using a headphone that's not so sensitive, it's probably going to cut it out and you'll just never know that there's a hiss there. And that's actually better. Whereas with a sensitive IEM, it can be an issue. So a little bit of a double-edged sword here. Of course, we do have to give an advantage. And in terms of efficiency, well, there is no denying that IEMs are more efficient than headphones. And finally, that'll bring us to talking about sound quality, which you might have thought was going to be the main difference between headphones and IEMs, but frankly, for me personally, it's kind of the last factor I consider when I'm choosing which form factor to use, because the more practical differences are the things that impact me more in day-to-day life, whereas the sound quality stuff, well, they both have some advantages and disadvantages. Except when it comes to closed-back headphones. Now, in my opinion, closed-back headphones generally kind of suck. I know there might be some practical reasons that might steer you toward a closed-back versus an open-back headphone, like you need that sound isolation. But in my opinion, if you need that sound isolation and sound quality is important, I think IEMs are frankly just flatly better than 99% of closed-back headphones out there. Now, there are some good sounding closed-backs out there, but in my collection, there's really just one closed-back headphone I listen to for fun, and it's a $2,000 headphone, so I can't really recommend that. Just generally, if we're talking about isolated sound quality, frankly, IEMs just have a really big advantage over here. Now, with open-back headphones, this comparison gets a lot trickier. Partly because personal preference is going to play a big part in this, frankly, but also because anything I can say, there's a lot of exceptions to. So generalizations are hard to make, but I'll make a few anyway. Like generally, I think that IEMs have better bass than headphones, especially if you want a lot of bass. An open back headphone like this, generally, it struggles to give you a lot of bass, or it even struggles to give you neutral extended bass. Like the planar headphones that are really well known for having great bass, they basically just achieve neutral bass in most cases, whereas with IEMs, like neutral bass is easy, that comes free, and if you want elevated clean bass, there's a lot of options with that as well. In the over-ear, open-back headphone market, there are some elevated bass headphones, but usually it comes at the expense of being kind of muddy and congested, whereas IEMs, generally you can have a lot of bass with them and still have it be nice and clean. It doesn't bleed into the mid-range. It's tight and it's punchy, it's fun, and it's energetic. So that's definitely going to be an advantage for IEMs, is going to be the bass. Now, when it comes to the mid-range, and specifically creating like a neutral, natural sounding mid-range, I think that headphones have a real advantage here. And it comes down to a nerdy but real factor of your own human anatomy, right? So when we use this word natural or neutral, we're kind of describing the way that things sound in the real natural world. And when things happen in the natural world, the sound happens, it interacts with your own human anatomy before it reaches your ear, and you perceive something that sounds natural. If you were to measure what it sounds like at my eardrum versus your eardrum, we'd actually measure something that's a little bit different. And when you have a headphone like this that's playing outside your ear, well, what your ear is doing to the sound doesn't matter so much. Whereas when it comes to an IEM, because this thing is actually going to bypass your outer ear and enter your ear canal, when they're designing the sound in this, it's going to have to make assumptions about what your head anatomy would do to the sound. And that plays a big part in terms of the timbre, the naturalness of the mid-range. So for that reason, frankly, I feel like headphones do generally have a very real advantage when it comes to mid-range. So yeah, we'll give that nod over here to headphones. And then when it comes to the treble, the high frequency areas of music, it's kind of a similar story. I think that headphones have a bit of an advantage for a very similar reason, although the issues are a little bit more acute. When it comes to treble, high frequency, IEMs are just more likely to have treble issues, right? They're more likely to introduce sibilance in your recording or create sharpness in like hi-hats and cymbals and stuff like that. And that's just because of the way that they fit inside your ear. Headphones are a little bit, I mean, they're not immune to treble issues. In fact, some of the most uncomfortable treble experiences I've had are with over-ear headphones. They're just going to be more consistent from person to person, whereas IEMs are going to vary a lot as it pertains to your own human anatomy. In fact, even with your own human anatomy, your individual anatomy with one IEM, you can change the way that treble sounds just by trying out different ear tips and trying different insertion depths. So just generally when it comes to creating a nice, consistent, smooth treble experience, I'm going to say that headphones do have a bit of an advantage here, although it can be somewhat mitigated with, again, a learning curve. Now, if I were to summarize those last 2 points in less technical terms, I'd say that IEMs are more personal, right? You need to find the one that works for you, whereas headphones can be a little bit more universal. But that's really just talking about anatomical differences. There's still preference differences, right? Do you want a headphone that's more bassy? Do you want something that's more neutral? Do you want something more relaxed, or you want something more excited and engaging? Or maybe you're like me and you kind of just want all of them. And in that case, I feel like IEMs have another advantage in that I think there's just more variety in IEM tunings. Partly, I think it has to do with the fact that there are anatomical differences and there's like a demand, there's a market demand and a reason to create a bunch of different tunings. But I also think that part of it is just the IEMs are a newer technology and there's like a lot of energy going into making new IEMs, maybe even too much, but there's new IEMs coming out all the time. Whereas I feel like in the headphone world, I don't want to call it stagnant, but like this is the best sounding headphone, one of the best sounding headphones. It came out about 30 years ago. So in the IEM world, there's just always something new, always something engaging. And while there's a lot of different sounding headphones, I don't find there's a lot of range of sounds that I enjoy. Let me put it that way. Whereas in the IEM world, there's a lot of different types of sounds that I find myself gravitating toward. So when it comes to this concept of choice, well, frankly, I'm going to give the advantage to IEMs. Now, the last point I want to make on sound quality is going to be like price to performance ratio, or how much do you have to spend to get good sound? And again, I think I'm going to give the advantage to IEMs, but it's up to a certain point, right? If your budget is $50, there's really only a handful of headphones that I would recommend, and they're all named costs and they all kind of have the same limitations. Whereas in the IEM world, $50 gets you access to some really good sounding stuff. And if you've got $100 in your budget, well, you've got a lot more IEMs to choose from. And frankly, no other headphones I would recommend. I would still recommend going with the cost stuff. And really, I think that advantage carries through up to about $200. Now, once you hit $200, $300, you start to be able to afford something like this, the Sennheiser HD600, which frankly I think is like one of the best sounding headphones out there. So at this point, the price advantage kind of goes away and it really is going to come down to personal preferences. But overall, again, because of that lower price budget, I'm going to say that IEMs have the advantage here. Now, there are other differences in terms of how headphones and IEMs sound, but frankly, I have a hard time describing them or quantifying them. And ultimately, I just think both headphones and IEMs sound fantastic. They're both capable of scratching that audiophile itch for me. Although, if you follow this channel, you probably know that I do personally gravitate more toward IEMs overall. But it really isn't for any of the practical, kind of rational reasons that we've been talking about. I just think they're small, they're cool, and collectible. I like them. Which is to say, like, I don't know, hopefully all this rationalization has helped you make a decision for yourself. But if you're looking into IEMs versus headphones, and you just find yourself gravitating toward one or the other, like, don't feel like you have to justify it with any rationalization. Just, know what you're getting into and enjoy the hobby. And with that said, a quick reminder that HiFiGo is making this content possible. If you want to make your next purchase of an IEM or a headphone, I've got them linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, and I'll catch you in the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get with the itch.